Imagine a country with widespread poverty and unemployment, high crime rates, drug problems, frequent riots, overpopulation, and illiteracy. Picture how terrible life would be there. You don't have to imagine for too long because this was Singapore in 1965. However, in the next 25 years, Singapore experienced a dramatic transformation that amazed the world. Today, Singapore is a highly developed, high-income country and is considered one of the top 5 richest countries in the world. It is also one of the cleanest countries with almost no corruption or crime. It is arguably the number 1 Asian country in many ways. But how did this happen? Who made this possible? In this video, we are going to explore the incredible story of Singapore. But before that, subscribe to this channel for more amazing content. Singapore is a tiny country, so small that it gets difficult to spot it on a map.
The hostility between Singapore's ethnic Chinese and Malays finally erupted into violent clashes.
From the lake of land in high density, but with some hefty government purchasing power, they did the impossible.
The Republic of Singapore was born.
Look at the map of Southeast Asia. You can clearly see Indonesia. The Philippines is easy to spot. Even Malaysia can be easily identified. But when you travel south, you will see the small island of Singapore. The water body strait of Johor separates Singapore and Malaysia. Singapore is half the size of Delhi area-wise. But on this small island, approximately 5.7 million people reside. The total area is 710 kilometers square, so the population density of Singapore is 8,028 people per square kilometer. We consider India to be an overpopulated country, but for comparison, India's population density is 446 people per square kilometer. So Singapore is 18 times more densely populated than India. Overall, it is the third most densely populated country, lagging behind Monaco and Macau. Interestingly, the origin of the name Singapore is from the Sanskrit word Singapura. Sing means line and pur is city. So Singapore means the line city. And here we got the reminder. Singapore is one of the 4 Asian tigers, the 4 highly developed countries in Asia: South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. Interestingly, the population density of these 4 countries is higher than India's. This might seem like a shocking fact to some, but many people blame India's population for the lack of development. But the GDP per capita and population density of the 2 tigers is much higher than India's. Talking about the people living here, Singapore is a diverse country. People belonging to various religions live harmoniously. There are people from the 5 major religions here: Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Taoism, and Hinduism. And there is a small population of people from Jewish, Zoroastrians, Jain, and Sikh communities. The second largest group is the people who do not believe in religion, the atheists. But apart from the religion, Singapore is very diverse in terms of ethnicity too. The largest majority is of Chinese ethnic people at 74.5%, followed by the Malays at 13.5%, and Indians at 9%. Among the Indians, largest populations are Tamils, Bengalis, and Punjabis, and the remaining 3% are made up of Eurasians and Arabs. While talking about the people, we should not forget about the Orang Lot. They are the original inhabitants living in Singapore for a very long time, the tribals. Overall unity in diversity is Singapore's present-day reality, but it was not the case always. Going back into history, in early history for a long time, the island of Singapore was used as trading island by the Malay, Thai, Indian, Arab, Japanese and Chinese traders. Throughout history, it was occupied by an Indonesian ruler, the Portuguese, the Dutch through their Dutch East India Company. And in 1819, an ambitious officer of the British East India Company, Thomas Raffles, bought Singapore from the Sultan of Johor. The British entered this island having bought it. Thomas Raffles turned Singapore into a free port, and a ship passing through would not have to pay any fees. This gave rise to free trading in Singapore. In 1869, the Suez Canal became operational so that the ship did not need to go around Africa. This led to even more ships coming to Singapore. Most ships used Singapore as a refueling station. In the nearby country, Malaysia, two industries were very popular: tin production and rubber production. Since Singapore was close by, Singapore became a rubber processing hub as well. This might sound like signs of development in Singapore, but there was a dark side to it as well. In reality, the Britishers were growing opium in Bengal, and they processed the opium in Singapore. The Britishers had employed Chinese porters for this job, where they could find one of the lowest grade opium. The Chinese people working in these factories were far from their homes, with no source of entertainment, so they turned into opium addicts. Thousands of opium addicts were living in Singapore. Crimes increased due to drug addiction. People turned to theft. In 1941, it was estimated that there were about 16,500 opium addicts in Singapore. The 1940s was the period of World War II. On 15 February 1942, Japanese invaded Singapore and Malaysia. Singapore surrendered to the Japanese. Over the next 3.5 years, the Japanese ruled over Singapore, and the Japanese rule completely destroyed Singapore. Chilling murders took place not only on the fields but in hospitals also. Several soldiers were tortured as prisoners of war. Thousands of people were used as forced labor. Women were being used as commodity. Thousands of women were brought in from Korea, China, Indonesia, and Malaysia to the comfort stations in Singapore, where they were available to the Japanese soldiers. By the time the Japanese lost the war in 1945 and withdrew from Singapore, there were more than 30,000 opium addicts, widespread gambling, and prostitution in the country. Buildings were heavily destroyed. There were large-scale poverty, high unemployment, and the place was crawling with diseases. There were food shortages and the people were starving to death. There was no end to crimes and violence, and Singapore had turned into a slum colony. After the end of World War II, the British reclaimed Singapore's control, and a British military administration tried to get things under some control. The basic services of gas, water, and electricity were restored. Canteens started to deal with the food crisis. The opinions of the Singaporeans about the British were quite favorable and positive as compared to countries like India. One of the biggest reasons for this was the British defeated the Japanese, and the Japanese were more atrocious towards Singaporeans. The second biggest reason was that the government changed in the UK in July 1945. The Conservative Party was no longer in power and the Labour Party came into power. They were against imperialism to some extent, so the British rule over Singapore slowly receded and turned into self-governance. In 1948, the first elections were held. The elections were held for only some seats. Singapore's constitution was framed. It was revised twice in 1955 and 1958. And you can see that in 1959, the proper full-scale elections were conducted. These elections were won by the young leader Lee Kuan Yew, the Secretary General of People's Action Party. He became the first Prime Minister of Singapore. Initially, Lee Kuan Yew believed that Singapore would not be able to survive as an independent country, and that they should become a part of Malaysia. He did this in 1963. He merged Singapore with Malaysia. But now comes the shocking twist in your story. The Malaysian government was not thrilled to have Singapore be a part of their country. The biggest reason for this was the 1964 Malaysian elections. PAP decided to contest that election. The Malaysian politicians did not like that a political party from Singapore was contesting in the national elections in Malaysia. On the other hand, the people living in Singapore was not happy with this merger because of the agreement that 40% of Singapore's revenue was to be paid to Malaysia's central government, even though Singapore's population was 17% of the combined population. Singaporeans felt that it was unfair. Additionally, as per Article 153 of the Malaysian Constitution, Malays were given special rights and privileges. The Chinese and the non-Malay ethnicities in Singapore did not like this discrimination. They saw how Malaysia was turning into Malay Malaysia, that it belonged to only the Malay people, while minorities were not given the same rights and equality. Due to these riots, in 1965, it was decided that Singapore will once again be separated from Malaysia and be an independent country. By this point in time, there was some industrialization in Singapore, but Singapore was still quite poor. It was a small country and had almost no natural resources. The revenue from port services was merely enough for the population of 1.9 million people to survive. But the amount of poverty and unemployment was so high that Singapore could have been classified as a third world country. The rate of unemployment was 13 to 14%. On top of it, there was housing crisis, a lack of healthcare services, no defense force. It was also a drug hub, and all of it led to more crime. The problem of squatter colonies and slums was growing, unhygienic and overcrowded, rife with crime and vice. These slums were also highly flammable. In fact, Singapore was as corrupt as China. This was Singapore's condition in 1965. In the very next part, we will see how it changed. In this first part, we have seen the dire conditions of Singapore in 1965 and the initial steps taken by Lee Kuan Yew and his team to tackle the housing crisis, boosting industrialization and root out corruption. In the next part, we will explore deeper into the role of workforce, the focus on healthcare, and how Singapore transformed into a modern-day miracle. Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories from around the world. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay informed.